Now, this is a faction I really don't know at all well, and also just to clarify, the 40k videos will be back soon. I just wanted to get a load of AOS content done whilst 4th edition is still new and fresh. And so today we are sticking with Age of Sigmar and swinging back around to the Order factions, and today we will be looking at the elusive, terrifying elves, which are the Idoneth Deepkin. These guys have always been very much a glass cannon, super mobile style army that was extreme to that extent, even in comparison to the other elf factions. And whilst a lot has changed for their faction, that same style of fighting and gameplay does return for them in 4th edition, and their battle traits are all based around a mechanic called the Tides of Death, and also some more movement trickery with Ethersea Voyages and Raiders from the Deep. The Ethersea Voyages is a rule that basically allows you to set up an entire regiment in reserve. This can't be done unit by unit from the looks of it, it is just the whole regiment, so a hero and all of the units that you've put in his regiment, and they are all set up in reserve essentially, travelling the Ethersea. And then this combos with the second part of this rule, which is Raiders from the Deep, and this allows you in your movement phase to bring on a unit that is travelling in the Ethersea, and they can come on 9 inches from a battlefield edge and 9 inches from enemies. So it's not quite as good as being able to deep strike anywhere like some other armies can do. You do have to come in from a board edge, but it means that you can potentially come in behind the enemy or on a flank of the enemy to steal an objective, or put a unit right in their backfield to really threaten a hero or a artillery piece or a unit that they were trying to keep safe. So it is a really nice utility tool to have for your deployment. The second bit of their battle traits is the Tides of Death. This is a series of buffs that move throughout the battle rounds and emulate the ebb and flow of the tide. So it's really thematic and fun, and also really quite powerful too, in terms of making your army this incredibly fast moving hit and run style force. It starts in battle round 1 with a low tide, and that gives your opponent -1 to their shooting attacks that target your units, and also -1 to hit with melee attacks as long as your unit didn't charge this turn. So it's just a great durability buff to help you move up the board and get into position, ready to get some charges off in subsequent turns, as well as, really importantly, to survive any potential turn 1 alpha strike that certain armies might be able to set up if they've got a load of shooting. In Battle Round 2, we move into the Flood Tide. This gives you the ability to run and then still shoot and or charge. So now you can really make sure you are right up in the enemy's face, unleash all of your shooting that you need to, and then follow it up with some charges. And this basically does all but guarantee that in Battle Round 2, you will be able to make any charge that you want to into your opponent, because you'll have your turn 1 move, and then your turn 2 you will have run and your movement to pretty much get as close as you possibly can to the units you want to charge. By round 3 we've hit the high tide, and this buffs you for those ongoing combats that you may be in after you've charged in last battle round. It gives your units strike first, so even if you haven't charged and you are just stuck in an ongoing combat from the previous turn, you will still get the advantage in being able to hit the enemy first and just do a load of damage into them before they can swing back. And then finally in round 4, the tide begins to ebb, and you gain the ability to retreat and still shoot and charge, and you don't take any mortal damage from retreat abilities. So this whole kind of battle tactic means that you can move up, run and charge, get into an ongoing combat and still be fighting first, and then by round 4 you can fall back and either recharge into your opponent, or you can fall back and move off and start fighting into another enemy unit nearby. It's just a super powerful set of rules each round that really tie in well with where you're going to want and expect your army to be at those points in the game, and it's going to mean you are going to very easily be able to get into combat when you need to, and you are going to be fighting first in most cases for at least 2 or 3 of those battle rounds. So it is just a really solid set of battle traits for the Deepkin. As ever, we also see 4 battle formations for the Idoneth. A couple seem very good and a couple are a little bit meh by comparison. The Nimati core rule of Surge Forward gives you reroll on your run and charge rolls for Nimati units whenever they are wholly within 12 inches of your Aelan units. So this is basically all of your Reavers and Thralls, your basic generic battle line style infantry, and the Aelan units are your more elite heroes and mounted cavalry units. So it is pretty easy to keep your Nimati units in that 12-inch bubble, and it could mean that if you bring them on with the Raiders of the Deep battle trait, you can quite easily get a re-rollable charge off on a few of your Nimati units, which will make it much more likely that at least a couple are going to get into combat. The Aelan Beastmasters brings Ferocious Predators as a rule. This gives you +1 to hit for all of your companion weapons on Aelan units. Now, there are quite a few of these, with the mounts of the Aelan King being companion attacks, as well as your Alapexes, your Fang Morras, and even the Leviathan's fins and jaws are companion attacks, so you will get a lot of benefit from this if you are bringing those units, and those units tend to be hitting on either 3s or 4s, so it is actually going to be a fairly big boost to your output as well if you are running a load of those big monsters or mounted units. The Isharan Council brings the Wisdom of the Deep. This one is one of the ones that I think is a bit meh. You get +1 to your casting, ritual, and lure light rolls for your Isharan units, but they have to be in combat range of another friendly Isharan unit. Now, the Isharan units are your standard sort of foot heroes and foot wizards, so it isn't difficult to keep them bunched up per se. I just think it's probably not the most useful thing to be doing, especially with your wizards. You would much rather have them spread out a bit to bring some more range on their various auras and buffs and spells rather than bunching them all together. So I think whilst the bonus itself isn't bad, I think it just pushes you into playing an army that is much more bunched up and restrictive, which doesn't really mesh well with how the overall Idoneth mechanics work. Finally, Fade Like Mist is the rule for the Soul Raid ambushes. This gives you a once per turn ability at the end of your turn where you can pick an Idoneth cavalry or infantry unit wholly within 3 inches of a terrain feature, and it can be removed from the battlefield and set up in the Ethersea. So you can do this at the end of your turn to remove a unit that might be about to get charged in the next enemy turn, or just needs to get to the other end of the board really quickly, and then in your next movement phase you can bring them back where you need them, coming in 9 inches from a board edge. So this again is great. The only caveat is that you need to be wholly within 3 inches of a terrain feature, so it could be in some cases a little bit difficult to do with some units depending on the size of the unit and also the size and layout of your board and terrain. But overall it's a very good trait, and I would say if you want some more mobility and flexibility in your army, it's not a bad one to go for. In terms of their heroic traits and artifacts, again we've got a fairly solid selection, a few of which are similar to others we've seen in previous ones of these reviews. Ancient Pride is the unmodified 1-3's miss, so adding a little bit of durability to your heroes and could definitely make some of your more melee focused characters like the Aelan King really quite durable as he goes into combat. The Hunter of Souls gives the hero a simple +1 rend against other heroes, which doesn't sound amazing, but actually could turn one of your fightier heroes again into a really scary character assassin. Something like the Aspect of the Storm Eidolon can potentially make an enemy hero strike last, and then be throwing 6 3-rend 3 damage attacks into them, which will definitely do a lot with this artifact. Finally, the Nightmare Legacy lets you at the end of any turn pick an enemy unit that has any damage points allocated to it by your hero that turn, and they have to subtract d6 from their control score for the rest of their turn. So this could really help you flip an objective on the next turn, although the downside is it is quite swingy being d6, so in some cases you are just going to roll a 1 or a 2, and whilst that will still reduce their control score, it might not be enough to do what you need it to. So I would say personally this is the weakest of the bunch, and that's because whilst impacting control scores is important and vital in Age of Sigmar 4th edition, having it be a d6 roll just makes it a little bit too unreliable in some cases for me. So I don't think it's going to be as useful all the time. And again, it's going to be one of those things where you need a 3+ or whatever to reduce the control to a level where you can flip the objective and you'll roll a 1 or a 2 and it'll just be a really feels bad moment. On the artifacts front, the Armor of Sethai gives you a great passive that means all weapon abilities aside from Companion have no effect on your hero. So all of those weapons with crit auto wound or crit 2 hits or crit mortal, anything like that, let's be honest, most weapons seem to have these days, they won't proc any of those extra effects, and this can be really good if a particular army or unit is relying on them. Something like the Nadirite weapons of the Ossiarch Bone Reapers will be much less impactful into your hero if they can't get those exploding hits, and it is just another fantastic way to keep a fighty hero alive even into big, scary enemy units and monsters for as long as possible. The Delicious Morsels are a once per turn ability at the end of any movement phase, and they let you heal D3 to any Idoneth cavalry within the hero's combat range. This is nice and simple, and being any movement phase means that you can get a lot of health back on your cavalry over the course of the game. And then the last has got the awesome name, it's called Dritch Leech, and it's a very simple but very effective passive that causes enemy wizards to have -1 to their cast rolls when they're within 18 inches of your hero. So it is a really, really big aura, and dropping spellcasting by 1 can be very significant, making even those 7+ to cast spells on average not go off anymore by someone without any bonuses to cast, and even impacting things that do have a bonus like Nagash to make them much less reliable for your opponent are very, very powerful effects to bring to the game. In terms of your own lore, the Lore of the Deeps is the Deepkin one, and it has 2 good and 1 amazing spell. The Pressure of the Deep is your standard 7+ to cast anti-horde one that lets you do mortal damage on a 5+ when you roll a dice for each model in an enemy unit that is within 18 inches. It's standard and straightforward, but still very good. And then Arcane Corrasion is actually quite a unique debuff. It's cast on a 6 and you pick an enemy unit within 12 inches of your wizard and they get -1 to their rend for their melee weapons. So if you are about to be charged, this can be super handy, and it stacks really efficiently with things like all out defense because they are impacting different things. One is your save roll and the other is enemy rend. So it is actually quite nice and can really stop a scary enemy unit from doing anywhere near as much damage to you as you might be expecting. The final spell is Steed of Tides, and this one is just fantastic. It's cast on a 6, so it's relatively easy to cast, and you pick a Deepkin unit wholly within 12 inches of the caster, in your hero phase remember, and it can be removed from the battlefield and set up again 9 inches from enemies. Now this is obviously really good from getting away from a potential enemy charge in their next turn, or to get yourself onto a faraway objective, but the crucial thing for this spell is it doesn't say the unit you pick has to be out of combat. So you can, at least for now anyway, use this to pull a unit out of combat to leave an enemy unit open and stranded for you to then shoot into, or just leave completely out of position and vulnerable for your incoming turn. It is super, super strong, and I think whilst it might get FAQ'd to say you can't do it on units in combat, for now at least it is incredibly good. But now onto the Warscrolls, and first up we have the 2 big heroes, which are the Eidolons of Mathlan, and you get one based around the storm and one based around the sea. The aspect of the storm is a hefty 330 points, but it does bring you a very healthy 10-inch move with 12 health, a 3-up save and a native 5+ ward, so he is quite durable for that cost, and he also has some terrifying melee output too, with the Spear of Repressed Fury netting him 6 attacks that hit on 3s, wound on 2s, with 2 rend and 3 damage on the charge. On top of that, he also has 6 slightly more mediocre anti-chaff style attacks to go along with it, so he can do a lot of work in melee. He is also a monster, so he gets a nice rampage. His is Pulled into the Depths. This is once per turn in any charge phase, and it lets you pick an enemy hero and give them the strike last on a 3+ that I mentioned earlier. So it's a great way to debuff a big scary hero who you may want to hit before they hit you. He can freely retreat and charge thanks to crashing upon the foe, which is nice. It's a little bit redundant in battle round 4, but it's still great if he is in combat earlier than that and wants to jump into another enemy unit to fight them instead. And then he also buffs your Deepkin units around him with an impressively strong +1 to wound thanks to Drench with Hate. This has got a 12-inch range, and any Deepkin unit wholly within it will get that really nice bonus to their wound roll. The Aspect of the Sea, by comparison, is a pricier 350 points. He has the same 12 health, 3-up save, and 5-up ward, but this one is also a level 2 wizard, so he adds a lot of value to your army from that perspective. He is less killy by comparison, with 5 attacks that hit and wound on 3s with 1 rend and D3 damage, and then the same 6 anti-chaff companion attacks. But he does also get a rather nice 3 ranged attacks that hit and wound on 3s with 2 rend and D3 damage, so he can actually kill off a few models that get too close to him with shooting if he needs to as well. In terms of his rules, he gets a passive +1 to cast, which is super powerful in 4th edition, and also the ability to let Deepkin units wholly within 12 inches ignore penalties to their control scores. So all of those debuffs that other armies can do to your control can be outright ignored, and that means you are much more likely to keep and hold or take an objective from an enemy. Being a monster as well as being a wizard, he also gets a rampage and also a spell on his war scroll. The rampage is Vengeful Waves, which is again once per turn in any charge phase, and if your Eidolon hasn't charged this turn, you can roll a dice and on a 3+, the enemy unit that is in combat with you can't use any commands that turn. So it's a nice way to turn off things like all-out attack or any other abilities they may have up their sleeves. The spell he has is Tsunami of Terror, and this is cast on a fairly hefty 8+, so it's quite tricky even with your +1 to cast, but it lets you pick 3 units within 12 inches and you give them -1 to their saves until your next turn, so it's expensive but super strong, essentially letting you massively debuff 3 enemy units and making all of your army's attacks into them much deadlier. The first of our named heroes is up next, Volturos, the High King of the Deep. He is a massive melee beatstick and also fairly tanky with 8 health and a 3-up save. He's got the Astra Solus as his weapon, which is 6 attacks that hit on 2s, wound on 3s with 2 rend, and again 3 damage on the charge. On top of that, he also has his mount, which has got 4 attacks with 1 rend and 2 damage. Now they only hit on 4s, but again, it's a companion attack, so it can get to 3s in the formation. Volturnos is 270 points, so he isn't just a melee beatstick, he also gives you some really nice buffs. He gives your Aelan units wholly within 12 inches +1 to hit, so he's basically a free bubble of all-out attack, and is also really solid with his fancy shield, which is called Kealith or Sealith, I don't know how you pronounce that, and that gives him a 3-up ward save against mortal damage from spells, prayers, and manifestations. So he's pretty durable against those magical attacks on top of that. And then his final ability is once per battle, he can use the Supreme Lord of the Tides, and this allows you to pick 3 friendly Deepkin units wholly within 12 inches, and they get +1 attack for the turn. So if he charges in with the 3 other units, he can make all of them +1 attack, and as long as they're wholly within 12 inches, also +1 to hit. So pretty much anything they touch is going to be dead. So I think he's really solid. He's fast, he's tanky, he's punchy, and he's also really good at buffing your army. The standard non-named Aelan King is similar. He's just got 1 less health. The mount attacks are the same, but instead the Aelan King has 5 attacks and they only hit on 3s and wound on 4s. They are also only 1 rend, but they are still 3 damage on the charge. So he is significantly less killy, but he's also a whole 70 points cheaper at just 200 points. He gets a Warscroll ability, which is named after one of the best Nintendo 64 games ever, Wave Rider, and this lets him, if he's charged that turn, roll a dice, and on a 2+, he does that much mortal damage to an enemy unit in combat range, but he also gets +1 rend for the turn on his royal weapons, so he can get up to rend 2 on them, which is quite helpful. He also has a reaction in Aelan Paragon, which, as we've seen before, allows him, after he's fought, to select a unit, in this case any non-hero Aelan cavalry that haven't fought, and they can swing immediately after him. So it's a nice way to double punch into an enemy before they can fight back. Up next, we have the plethora of Isharan foot heroes, and we start off with the Isharan Tidecaster. He's 150 points, so he's not super pricey, and he is a 1-cast wizard with 5 health and a 5-up save. He's got some pretty bad melee output with 3 attacks at 1 rend and d3 damage, and then 2 companion attacks that are 4s and 4s with no rend. And weirdly, he doesn't actually have his own Warscroll spell. Instead, he has a once per turn ability, which is Master of the Efficacy. This allows you to roll in your hero phase, and on a 3+, you can pick one effect. Either Creeping Mist to give you a fantastic buff, making your friendly Deepkin units untargetable by enemy shooting unless that enemy unit is within 12 inches of them, or Surging Stream, which gives you +1 to your run and charge rolls, or Spiteful Riptide, which lets you do d3 mortal damage to an enemy if they retreat. Now this will be on top of the standard d3 they take, so you can really punish an enemy unit that does want to try and retreat from you, but all of them I think are really useful. It is risky, of course, only being on a 3+, so you can't guarantee it, but getting things like that untargetable buff up could make an army like the Lumineth or the Caradron just be able to do pretty much nothing for a turn into you, so it can be really, really powerful. Lotan is up next. He's another of the named heroes. He's the dude with the fancy octopus friend, and again, he's got 5 health and a 5-up save. He isn't a wizard himself, but he does have some okay melee, at least in terms of sheer volume. He's got 8 attacks, and yes, they only hit and wound on 4s, but they do have 1 rend. And again, they're companion attacks, so in the right battle formation, he could be hitting on 3s. He's got 2 passives, Catalogue of Souls, which gives your units +3 to their control score when they are wholly within 12 inches of him, and then also Fount of Willpower, which gives +1 to casting rolls for Isharan units wholly within 12 again. So in the Isharan Council battle formation, this can be getting some of your casters to +2 to their casting rolls, which is very, very nice. Again, in general, I don't think it's the best formation, but if you are running it, he can definitely make it much, much better. And for 110 points, he's not a too expensive way to do so. Keeping the theme with 5 health and a 5-up save is the Isharan Soul Scryer. This is again a 1-cast wizard, and he's got some really bad shooting with his Scryfish Shoal, and also some really bad melee with the Abyssal Touch. But again, he's more of a buff piece than a fighter. He can let a unit that is coming in from the Efficacy set up 7 inches away from enemies instead of 9 inches. Now, they do have to be within 12 inches of him, but it means that a potential 7-inch charge instead of a 9-inch charge is possible for some units, and that is really quite a strong buff for one of your scary melee units. He also gets to use his Cypher Compass on an enemy hero once per turn, and this lets you pick an enemy hero within 18 inches and you roll a dice, and on a 3+, all of your Deepkin units get +1 to wound against that hero. So if you are up against someone scary like Nagash or Archaon and you really need them dead, this can be a great way to get a load more damage into them. The Soul Scryer is 120 points, so he's not super expensive, and I would say as a 1-cast wizard with those 2 fairly nice Warscroll abilities, he's not actually a bad pick to be bringing along. The final Isharan foot hero is the Soul Render. He's 140 points, so he's a little bit pricier, but he does have a slightly better 3-up save, and he's also got some better melee with 4 2-damage attacks that hit on 3s and then wound on 4s. Again, it's his Warscroll abilities where his real power lie though, and Lure Light lets you pick up to 3 friendly Nimatis units wholly within 12 inches of him, and you can make a d3 roll for each, and on a 2+ on the D3, they return that many models to the unit. You may remember this roll can get +1 from the battle formation as well, so it means you are much more likely to bring back a full 3 models to each of those units rather than just 2, so it's a great way to get some power back into a unit that may have been hurt in a previous fight phase. And then his other ability is Hangman's Knot. This lets you pick an enemy hero in combat with your soul render, and you roll a 2d6, and if you roll more than the target's health characteristic, it is just destroyed. Now this is once per battle, but the average on 2d6 is 7, so any enemy hero or character with 6 or less health is quite liable to just get one shot by this guy, and that includes things like Vampire Lords, Chaos Sorcerers, Slaughter Priests. It is really, really good, and yes, it won't happen all the time, but I think it's reliable enough into squishier heroes that this guy is probably well worth those 140 points. Up next, we move on to your mounted cavalry units. The Aelan Alpex is first. This is the big single shark unit. It's 8 health with a 4-up save and a 12-inch move, so it's fast and, it's not amazingly tanky, but it's got a decent 8 health. It is pricey though at 190 points. It does have a solid mix of ranged or melee options though, with either a harpoon or a net launcher for either anti-monster or anti-cavalry shooting. The same profile depending on what you go for, but just extra rend against your chosen target. And then it's also got some fairly scary melee with 4 attacks that hit on 3s, wound on 4s with 1 rend, and then an extra 3 attacks that hit on 4s, wound on 2s with 2 rend, 2 damage, and are +1 rend into monsters. So it's pretty punchy in combat and at range, and it also gets +1 attacks to its bite if it's within 6 inches of any damaged enemy units or enemy units that have lost any models this turn. And then finally, it can also, in the shooting phase, do some debuffing. You pick an enemy monster or cavalry unit that took any damage from its shooting attacks, and then you can roll a dice, and on a 3+, they get 1 less dice for their charge rolls in their turn, so you can make it much more difficult for your opponent to actually get a big scary monster into combat. The Morr Guard are the smaller eel riding fellas. They are much squishier with only 4 health, but they can move further with a tasty 14-inch move, and then they have that 4-up save as well. They come in units of 3 for 170 points, so they're around 56 points per model, and they do get some solid anti-infantry attacks with their Volt Spears, which hit on 3s, wound on 4s, with 2 rend against infantry, and then 2 damage on the charge, and then also some not shabby, admittedly, companion attacks too from their Fang Morras. They only hit on 4s, but then they wound on 3s with 1 rend and D3 damage. Their ability is the Biovoltaic Blast, which is in any charge phase, and if this unit charged, you pick an enemy unit within 1 inch, and you roll a number of dice equal to the models in your unit, so 3 or 6 most of the time, and then for each 4 or 5, you do 1 mortal damage, and on a 6 you do D3 mortal damage, and then you get +1 to that roll if you outnumber the target. So into something like a single monster, this can actually do a decent chunk of extra damage, getting you around 6 mortal damage into a solo monster from a unit of 6 of these guys. The Shallen Guard are slightly different eel riders. They're the same stat line, but with 1 extra attack instead of the +1 damage on the charge. So they're a bit more reliable in ongoing combats, and then they also get a bit more defense with a 5-up ward if they've charged thanks to their Galv shields. They also get a combat phase ability. Theirs is called Biovoltaic Barrier. Unlike the Blast, this debuffs the enemy. You roll a d6, and on a 3+, the enemy unit you've picked as the target is -1 to their attacks characteristic for the turn. So you can really debuff an enemy unit with these guys, making them 1 less attack per model, as well as if you've charged in, getting that tasty 5-up ward to keep yourself even safer. Now they are 180 points, so they're that little bit pricier than the Morr Guard, but they are very, very good for tying up big squads of enemy infantry basically all game long. Next up we have the Leviathan, which is the gigantic cool turtle thing. It's a whopping 500 points, so it's nearly Scarbrand prices, but with 16 health, a 3-up save and a 5-up ward, he is very tanky. He's got 7 companion attacks which hit on 4s, wound on 2s with 2 rend and 3 damage, and they have the crit mortal rule, so he can do a load of damage in combat, and then even at range he's got some solid anti-monster shooting with harpoon launchers, which are a flat 3 damage, 2 rend against monsters, and with 4 shots. Now he does lose some attacks from his fins and jaws when he's damaged, but he is just a really reliable, hefty damaging monster, and also a really good buffing piece, bringing a very welcome 5-up ward to all Deepkin units that are wholly within 6 inches, and then also letting you in any charge phase once per turn pick an enemy unit if this guy has charged, and on a 3+ on a d6 you do that much mortal damage to them. So he can potentially do a solid 4 or 5 or 6 mortal damage to an enemy as he charges into them. We've got another hero next in the Thrallmaster. This is the one that works closely with your Nimati units. He's only 5 health and a 5-up save, so he is squishy, but he does have some okay melee attacks that hit on 3s, wound on 4s, and do 2 damage, and he can also give any Nimati unit wholly within 12 inches of him in any combat phase either the crit 2 hits rule or make them -1 to be wounded. So you can make your Nimati units much deadlier or just much tankier if you need them to survive. He also has a reaction that lets a Nimati unit fight after him with Thrallmaster, so he is just really, really good if you are bringing Nimati units in your army. And the first of those Nimati units is the Reavers. They are a fantastic 7-inch move, but they are super flimsy with 1 health and only a 5-up save. But they are only 13 points each though, and a unit of 10 can do some solid shooting, albeit at just a 12-inch range. But they hit on 3s, wound on 4s with 1 rend and the crit auto wound ability, so they can do some work, and then they can also shoot after they've run or retreated, so they can be very slippery and difficult to pin down as well. The melee version of them is the Nimati Thralls. They are cheaper at 120 points, but they do have the same flimsy 5-up save, and they are a little bit slower at only a 6-inch move. But in melee, they can do some solid work with 2 rend into infantry, and then even into monsters they are quite scary because they get a bump to 2 damage against monsters. So against a 4-up save monster unit, a squad of 10 of these can be doing nearly 9 damage, which is pretty solid work for just 120 points. Finally for the Idoneth is their terrain piece, the Gloomtide Shipwreck. This has only got 7 health and a 4-up save, but it is super good for protecting your army. It gives your infantry and cavalry units +1 to their saves if they are wholly within 6 inches, and it can actually be set up either as 1 or 2 terrain pieces. They do have to be wholly within friendly territory and 3 inches away from objectives, but it does mean you can potentially get 2 areas of the board where your forces can have that extra bit of durability, so it is really useful. And you will obviously want to set these up at key points where you expect fighting to happen, so you can make your infantry and cavalry units as durable as possible. I think overall the Idoneth appear to have kept that great flow of super fast movement and decently hard hitting melee that can then just fall back and just dance around your opponent. They are still very squishy based on most of the Warscrolls, but I think their traits, their formations, their spells, the Warscroll abilities really do let you make them into this incredibly mobile unit and mobile army, and your opponent will very likely get overwhelmed if they aren't careful, because you are going to have almost an entire army that can move, run, charge, fight first, and then retreat and charge in again, so you can very quickly dominate the movement and the fight phases of the game if your opponent isn't prepared for it. But as always, what do you make of the Idoneth? And do you think they will make a big splash into 4th edition? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and as always, thank you very much for watching. Please do like and subscribe for more Warhammer content from me, but until next time, I'll catch you later guys.